if I had like home, about, uh, fun.
Hey, Matt.
Hey, Mike.
Should we do a podcast?
I've heard of those. Yeah, we should try one.
Okay, maybe this time we'll get it right. Hello, and welcome to Hacking the Grepson for another exciting podcast about the world of programming and development and, anything that's even loosely related to that. Because we're in the 50s now, so we gotta branch out. You can only talk about variables and control structures for so long.
Yeah. All right. So, that's my favorite variable name. I use it now.
Yeah, sometimes when I do a double loop, I throw in a J.
Whoa.
IJ. Yeah, and if it gets crazy, I might go to K, but that's usually a code smell if you're hitting K.
Yep.
Should probably refactor that.
And that's our episode. Good night, everybody.
IJK, we out. No, I figured one topic that we somehow have not actually broached in the wider tech world is one that actually comes up a lot for me as a web dev, because basically I'm putting stuff on the internet for people to read or look at or interact with in some way, and that's millions, perhaps billions of people potentially, and I have a certain experience of the web, how I see it, how I interact with it, how I hear it. But not everybody shares my experience. And so I figured we should talk about accessibility, and specifically web accessibility, because I think, the web has been around for, I don't know. If only we had Tim Berners-Lee here, where we could just say like, hey, when did you make that thing?
Yeah, he should tell us. Come on, Tim.
I mean, he's the only definitive answer, I think.
Yeah, there's no other way for us to know.
No. We couldn't use any of the technology I just talked about to find this out.
We've had the web for at least 2 years.
Yes. I might be as bold to say at least 3.
All right. In all seriousness, let's see. I was a webmaster back in 1997, I think.
Back when that was a job title.
Back when that was a job title. So at least that long.
Yeah, I probably hopped on the web somewhere in the mid 90s, but I know it was around before then. So we'll just say 30, 40 years, something like that. And I would say the web has gotten a lot more complicated since then in terms of the features and what people expect of a website, which are largely web apps now, because they have interactivity, they have databases, they have users. And the thing is, though, that there's some really basic stuff about the web that still isn't so when it should be. For example, the structure of a web page. Like what comes first, the head, the body, the footer, that kind of stuff. And having the document that your web browser reads semantically be able to read that in a proper way. HTML, both as a pro and con, is a very loose parser. It will let you get away with a lot of bad code and still view something on the internet.
So specifically, you mean the fact that HTML does not prescribe what to do, and the fact that it is so freeform, that's okay for typically abled? I don't know what the right term for that is.
Yeah, it's. I guess my point is more that, like, the way that you code a website, there's like an outer container, an HTML container, and then there's an inner one inside that, which is a head tag, and that generally is where you put things like the title of the page, like maybe a description of it, links to style sheets that might change how the website looks, and then you get into the body, which is usually the content. That's where all the words and the pictures and anything that you actually see on a screen is. But we assume that everybody can see, and that they can see well enough at a certain text font size, and that they can see images of a certain resolution. But there's a lot of people, actually, that don't look at a website. They use like a screen reader, or they
Yeah.
have something read it to them.
In fact, I don't assume that everyone can see because one of my
Oh,
first jobs after I was a webmaster was working for a company that did distance learning for and most several of our users were blind. And so like I learned quite a bit about accessibility in the like web 1.0 days and what that meant. I'll be interested to hear from you what that sounds like today.
no, I actually really want to hear about the Web 1.0 days of trying to make a website accessible. Like, what did that even mean back then?
It was mostly around screen readers. Like that is like a huge thing. And what's interesting is some of the things that were the right way to do it back then, I have
Hmm.
seen are uh, distinctly not the way that people want things done anymore. So, for example, one of the first things I ever learned about accessibility was I should not put my menu bars on the sides. I should put them at the top. Right? So if I had like links,
Hmm.
because the screen reader, if I had like home, about, uh fun, whatever, right? Like if I had links at the top,
The three main sections of a website:
I
home,
haven't
about, and
made a
fun.
website in like 20 years. Uh, um, if I had those at the top, great. The screen reader would come through and it'd say home, fun, whatever the other one Matt said about. Right?
Hmm.
It would do those. And if I had it on the side, then it would be like home. This is Matt Messerman's fun page, and it would be
Hmm.
really confusing. Nowadays, I've heard the opposite is true.
Well, I mean, I will speak from someone who has not necessarily done a lot of web accessibility specific coding, and I mean that's kind of part of why I wanted to talk about this, is that there's definitely more tools, and the spec for HTML has changed. It has gotten
Considerably.
more yeah, it's gotten a lot more semantic. And by what I mean by semantic is that, like, instead of there was this thing that people used to call it div-itis, back when the div tag was created, which is just short for like division, which is just like a section of the page. The problem with div, I mean, it was great, but at the same time, it has no semantic meaning, because one div is semantically, it has the same meaning as any other div.
Yeah. It
Like
was like
it.
container is
Mhm.
basically what it was.
Right, box. It's as useful to a screen reader that is reading the code and trying to interpret it by parsing it and then reading it out loud to someone who can't see it, versus someone who can, it doesn't matter whether it's a div or a section or an aside or a footer, header, you're
Span.
just seeing, yeah, you're just seeing the website. You're not seeing the code behind and how it's structured. So it doesn't matter as much. But for someone using a screen reader, it's incredibly important that the semantics of the code, that it's semantically created rather than div, which is not as helpful.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because and you mentioned this at the top, and I was going to ask you about it, and then I distracted myself with my own anecdote. uh,
You jerk.
so I know that screen readers, when I had reason to know anything about them, which I haven't in like 30 years, uh, can't have been that long, 20 years, they read the screen, like what was actually on the screen. It would parse and like find letter, like it didn't necessarily read the source code. At least that's how it seemed to me. But the
Hmm.
way you described it, it sounds like, especially if you start talking about div tags and whatnot, that means that the screen reader is actually going in, parsing the HTML itself, and then spitting that in. Like it's basically a browser. Would be the way that would work. Whereas I was loading things up in Netscape Navigator, and then the screen reader would read off of what was there.
Yeah. Well, once again, I can see well enough to look at the websites that I work on, so I don't use a screen reader. And I don't want to speak for someone who regularly uses it, but from what I have done little research on, admittedly, I mean, the whole point, well, part of the point of making it more semantic is not necessarily just for screen readers. It's probably also for just data transfer. Like something like piping in HTML or piping out HTML so
Mm.
that it understands the document better. So it doesn't just see div 1 through 10, it sees header, section, aside, footer, navigation, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I'm pretty sure that a screen reader uses that information to better parse the page than something that's just div, 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 div.
I would
That doesn't
expect that
have
that's the
semantic meaning.
case these days. Like it seems
Yes.
like I mean when I was doing this was like 98, 99, right? It was like
Hmm.
that time period, 2000 give or take a year. Uh um
Like AOL was
and
still big.
right. But, the web was new-ish then.
Yeah.
People weren't it was unusual to have a web page still back then. GeoCities was in its infancy.
Hmm.
And also existed. Uh, uh, so having a relatively small portion of the population needs screen readers. So having one that was special to the web, which was this new thing, might not have made sense. Whereas having one that could just read whatever words were on the screen in whatever, if it was a Word document or whatever else people did, email, like you said,
Hmm.
right, then it wouldn't matter. But now the web is so ubiquitous and it is so like integral to our daily lives that it probably
Hmm.
would make more sense for a screen reader to be effectively a browser, uh, or at least an HTML parser. But yeah, the world has changed a lot.
I mean, yeah, when I think about what was on the web then, like, movies and animations were not big, pictures were few and far between, and it was largely text. It was largely just and the easiest way, I guess, to put something public on the internet that was largely text based that you could send a URL to someone and look at it. And it was easier to share than something like a news group like Usenet or IRC. You just everybody tended to have a browser. I think even in the late '90s, like Internet Explorer. I don't know if that was a thing yet, but like you said, Netscape
It's around then.
Navigator,
Yeah.
yeah, NCSA, Mosaic,
Early Firefox. It's not too
early
much later than that.
Firefox. But it was still largely text based, and so just having a screen reader didn't have to contend with much, and also the layouts in and this is why I think that like the actual structure of the page does matter because the layouts of the page do matter because I think the screen reader does take that into account, and having it be more semantic helps it parse and know what to actually read out loud, like what is content and what is structure, so that it doesn't just read stuff that doesn't make any sense to someone who is hearing the web page. Like it's an internal thing that would be useful for someone debugging it, but not someone for consuming it. But I think there's a lot more to accessibility than just how good does a screen reader handle a web page.
Right. Well, there's a lot of types of accessibility that or forms of accessibility that are necessary, right? Even just sticking with visual acuity, you could have great vision, but perhaps you're colorblind. Taking into account color blindness in your web page design is pretty important. One of my first jobs out of college was working on a helicopter, and we had to have on the display software, and when it was showing tracks, which are other vessels, right? We had not only a color, but a shape and a certain shading so that
Hmm.
no matter what your visual level was, or if it was, night outside or not, whatever, as long as you could see the thing, you could tell what it was. Now, most web pages are slightly less critical than flying chunk of metal, but it's still, a worthwhile thing to consider when you're doing your development.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a larger portion of people who are making websites these days where accessibility is a higher priority because it's bigger and accessible to more people, and so it's one of those things where like the the novelty of having a website is obviously long gone, and so the basic meat of a website is a solved problem, and so there's almost no excuse now to not also try to make it accessible to as many people as possible. Although it's not something that at least I have been a part of, where like if we're starting something from scratch, making it accessible is not necessarily a top priority. It's still kind of like a secondary or tertiary concern.
But you do actually think about it. Like it is actually something that you do discuss, and like are you
Yes.
required to make things accessible, or is it something you guys choose to do? I think
I,
in an
I mean,
academic situation, I would expect that it's kind of like, no, you have to do this.
working in academia, it is more important. Working on the web, making all of our websites as accessible as possible is definitely important, and has become more important over time. And I think it's great, and I find it an interesting. As someone who just likes to solve puzzles, it's fun to think about like how can we make this more accessible. And like you were talking about the color blindness, even if you're not colorblind, even just something as simple as color contrast is something that I've looked at a lot more in the past, just using like the dev tools in a web browser.
Mm.
I know Chrome does it. I'm sure the other ones do it as well, but like you can look at the color of something on a website, and it can give you like an index of like this is above a certain threshold of some standard of contrast, or it's not, and you should don't put pink on a red background. That's a bad idea because you can't read it. So instead, you should know some minor color theory about how certain colors go together, and don't put colors that are very close to each other on like a color wheel because you can't read them. That's a super simple thing to make your website more accessible that like is somehow still is still violated on the web these
Oh,
days,
frequently, all the
despite.
time. I mean, I make any web page I make these days black and white, text only. No menus. You have to. It's like a text adventure game.
Hmm.
That's the only way to do it. So, what kind of accessibility concerns have you had to actually consider? Because pretty much screen readers were the only thing that and color blindness stuff were the only things that were even discussed back in the very late '90s, early 2000s world that I was in. So, what kind of things have you had to solve?
Yeah, I'm looking at the w3.org's page on they have a web accessibility initiative, WAI. They break down the web into different categories of differently abled experiences, like people who have auditory issues. There's cognitive, there's neurological, there's physical, there's speech, and then there's obviously visual. I think that visual is probably the one that we think about the most. Just like I said, the size of images, whether they have proper alt
Oh yeah,
tags.
and
Alt tags
titles.
are and titles. Yeah, like alt tags are important, and actually, they're important both for existing and not existing. And I'll explain. Because when I think about the web, I think about images on the web. There's definitely like two main categories of images on the web. There's sort of like what I'll call like useful images, or functional images, where being able to see what the content is actually informs you or helps you in some way.
Right,
And
it's
then there's
pertinent to
more.
what you're actually reading.
Right, right, like a chart or a graph or something that's
Yeah,
explaining something that's happening. And then you have what is probably the majority of images on the internet, which is kind of like,
pictures of cats.
yeah, they're just nice to look at. They break up the text. Everybody, if you go on any social media platform ever, the kinds of things that get more engagement are always visuals over blocks of text. So obviously, we can't issue text entirely until we go completely emoji. So until then, mixing in some images, some flavor images with your text helps break up the monotony of text, but also, I mean, if you've ever read a magazine, you can do a lot more interesting, layouts with images that, can convey emotions and feelings as you're reading something.
Yeah, it's an entire art style just for that, right? But one I am quite bad at. I can write
Right.
all day. You ask me to make something look pretty, you're barking up the wrong tree.
I mean, yeah, it's a skill. But anyway, back to the alt tags. You definitely want alt tags for the informational images. You don't necessarily want alt tags for the flavor images, because it can be confusing
Mm.
if the flavor images don't actually convey any information. They're really just there to break up the text and to, kind of create a mood or a feeling or something. Um, that text could be a distractor from the actual content on the web, and so that's an interesting thing to think about. It's true that you need an alt attribute on every image tag to kind of pass muster with the standard, but you actually only want to have actual text in there if it's useful and if it's not a distractor. So there's one example. There's another initiative called Aria. You may have heard of Aria, not necessarily the solo vocal performance. Let's see,
Wasn't
I'm
she the
trying
Little Mermaid?
to close.
Oh wait, no, she's from Game of Thrones. That's who Arya is.
Yeah, this is ARIA, not
Oh,
ARYA. It stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications.
huh.
And according to Mozilla's developer docs, which I also use a lot and I find very helpful, um, it's a set of roles and attributes that define ways to make web content and web applications, especially those developed with JavaScript, more accessible to people with disabilities. Um, so these are tags. These are attributes. Sorry. So if you have like an image tag in a web page, you might put an aria. Well, remember how I was talking about the semanticness of your document. Instead of having the divitis, instead you have like this thing is a header, this is a navigational toolbar or whatever. Aria, the aria role of a tag is important for screen readers because they use that to parse the document better, and so they know when they're looking over something. Like your issue with the menu being at the top versus the side, if you have these aria roles and you tag the menu as aria role menu or navigation or toolbar or something, then the screen reader knows that it's a menu and that it can probably skip it when it's like when you just say give me the content of this page, and it doesn't just
Huh.
constantly read over the menu. Because before, like you said, it didn't have the intelligence to know that this thing on the screen has a specific role and perhaps is not part of the blog post. You know, so if you tag it that way, then this tool knows it and can better parse it.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. The same thing with like interactive things like aria role button. Like this link is a
You
button
can click
specifically.
this.
You can click this and it has all of these attributes that buttons have. Like you said, they can be clicked, they can be disabled, they can be depressed or not depressed, etc. They can either be on Zoloft or not on Zoloft. Um, yeah, so stuff like that. So those kinds of tags come from this desire to make the code more semantically meaningful, so that things that try to access it that aren't just your eyes reading it and parsing it can better understand what the content is. And that, I think that's a step forward for accessibility that everybody could easily do on every web page that ever is existing. um, why don't people do that, or why don't people still don't do that?
I bet a lot of them don't even know. It probably didn't even cross their mind to think about someone who's not themselves. That is, most
Yes.
people in the world are like that. I bet a lot of people don't know that you. I didn't know about the ARIA tag. I don't create web pages, but and then there's so many different types of accessibility needs. I can think that it's easy to miss some. I could think of some off the top of my head that are more obvious to me, like flashing lights might cause epilepsy. You don't want to have really loud noises, so if someone's really sound sensitive like I am, like that kind of thing. But you know, those that's about the extent of what I would think of off the top of my head.
A simple example would be like a video that you might have embedded on your webpage, making sure that the default volume is at something reasonable, like 25% instead of 100%, because well, obviously people want to watch my video and listen to it at full blast. Who wouldn't want to do that? Like you said, stop thinking about your main goal, which is to make a splash, and instead think about a wider range of people. And also, like, they might be doing something else, they may not be expecting it to be super loud, and you can always raise the volume. But once you've blasted them with the 100% volume, that may be the end. They may leave because they're like, "Whoa, what's
Oh,
up
I
with this
will.
page?"
Yeah, I'm like, oh,
Right?
that one's making noise. Click. It's gone.
Yeah. Well, and then there's the whole advertisement industry, which
Ugh.
seems hell bent on doing the exact opposite of all these things, which is to get in your face and throw things on the page. And, who cares about accessibility? The whole point is to get your attention in every possible way you can. So, there's always going to be that issue. A good way to get a quick overview of some of the things that the W3 organization thinks is important for accessibility on the web is the WCAG, thankfully. And, oh, yes, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So that's essentially a list of things that your website should do in order to be accessible. And it's at version 2.1 right now, and it's definitely come up at my work, and it is definitely something I've used to try to make our sites more accessible. So some of the things they mention that you should be doing are,
Me? Okay.
yes, you specifically, nobody else. So listen up.
So Matt should be doing these
Yeah,
things.
it
Got
actually
Okay.
says your name right here and your last name and everything. It's crazy.
Oh, no.
I don't know
Is
how
that
they
my
did that.
address? Am I doxxed?
Yep, yep. So the first thing is text alternatives, which we already touched on with alt tags, but also it's like if you only have audio or video conveying the information, it's also good to have text. Captions are really good. I loved it when YouTube started doing their auto captioning service on every video. I was like,
yeah.
yes, this is great, because sometimes I don't have the wherewithal to listen to the sound, or I'm in a noisy environment, or I just don't want to have the volume up, and having captions are amazing.
Yeah, I have a bit of an auditory processing issue, and it's
Oh,
actually difficult for me sometimes to figure out what is being said, especially if there's extra noise going on. So I have captions on all the time. I have since I was like a teenager. I've watched TV with captions on. I have on the side of our little chat window right here, I have the auto-generated captions that are popping up.
oh,
Just in
really?
case.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, captions are great, and if your site is heavy on the audio or the video, having transcripts or captions are great. Um, the next section is about making your content adaptable, which is basically just what I was talking about. Is having the code be semantic and not unsemantic, so that other technologies that try to read your website can understand it better. We talked about the use of color, contrast. There's definitely, there's certain things that it's not quite cross cultural, but things like, greenish hues are generally like, this is a good thing, this is a positive thing, this is a go forward thing. Having red be a cancel or a stop or a back is a fairly good guideline to stick to when
Yeah.
you're doing stuff.
Like on the window we have right here, leave is in red.
Mm-hmm.
And that indicates to me that it's like a terminal condition to what we would do, but not necessarily. I've also seen people to use red to be like, hey, pay attention to this. So it's usually it's important.
Yeah, it is important, and I think about it like when I'm just coding or making something for a personal project. I do think about these things because I think about how can I make it easier to scan my code. And so any kind of, like, if there's a color option, I might color certain things just so they stick out more. And that's just, in a way that makes it more accessible, because you can quickly scan something and say, oh, this is, if you're looking like a log or something, you can see a bunch of green stuff
Oh,
come
yeah.
up. Oh, I can ignore that because that's all good. Oop, there's a red thing. I should pay attention to that. I don't even have to read the words. I just know that calls my attention immediately, and that makes it more accessible.
Red's an error, yellow's a warning, green's okay.
Yeah, and I see that in lots of software stuff. Yeah, they talk about being able to resize text, because
Yep, that's very important.
lots of people choose, a specific font, but that's not necessarily good for everybody, and it should be able to work within a range, not necessarily 192 impact font, but between 10 and 20. Your content should not break if somebody decides to change it, to make it easier to
Yeah.
read.
If your parents or grandparents have a smartphone, you've probably seen that their text message font is like 192 DPI, and that's okay. That's good for them.
Yeah.
They can see one letter at a time, and that's fine.
Right. And also make sure that those letters that comprise words in the sentences have the correct spacing and they're not all bunched up. Make sure to do your leading and
Oh,
your kerning properly. Because, and yes, I mean, I'm in my 40s now and I started using the web in my 20s, and my vision and ability to read super tiny text on a large, as screens have gotten larger and the text gets
yeah.
smaller, it's harder to read. Just, full
Yep.
stop.
I tend to read things at about 125%. Most of my web pages tend to get that one little bump.
Yeah. So yeah, make your stuff flexible.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I remember this all kind of started, and it wasn't because of accessibility, but I remember the first time I heard about responsive design,
Oh,
and
yeah.
making a web page or an app, on phones work on a small phone screen, on a tablet screen, on a huge desktop screen. I mean,
Yeah.
there's not necessarily a one size fits all, and so you have to know that it could change, and you have to be able. It has to be adaptable. That's the thing. Responsive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, it's not even necessarily accessibility related there. It's, oh, we want people to be able to resize their browser window because they will, and we want our content to still look good
Exactly. It's
or see it on multiple different devices.
yeah. It's definitely. I mean, it's definitely there was definitely a transitory time where trying to think about a website not just being viewed on like a desktop PC was a bit of an obstacle, because you had to think, there's a thing called like mobile first design, where instead you design your website so it works good on a phone, and then you make it more complicated as the monitor gets bigger, or the resolution gets bigger. Um,
Hmm.
I don't necessarily do that all the time. I mean, because I'm often working on a website on a large screen, and then I'm like, oh yeah, I got to think about, does this just break on my phone? Does it just look terrible? Does everything, does it collapse properly? But as time has gone on, people have gotten more used to thinking about that, and I don't. Responsive design is not really like a buzzword anymore. It's just standard. You just have to make your
Yeah.
stuff work.
You have to do it that way because you don't know how people are going to look at your stuff. You
Exactly.
used to. You it used to be there was one way to do things,
Right.
and now there's not, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's okay, and I actually like the challenge of trying to take a big complicated website and make it work nicely on a phone, and getting rid of the cruft and making things smaller and making it like, scrollable, as opposed to like mouse look around clickable. Speaking of which, the interface to a website on a phone or a tablet is
Oh
completely
yeah.
different than on a computer. You're not using a keyboard and a mouse. Um, I built an online keyboard, like musical keyboard that you can play like a piano, and I had to think, okay, I could be using a keyboard, like an actual computer keyboard, and like if I press the A key, that does a C on the piano, but I also might be using my mouse and clicking on the keys, but I also might be on my phone tapping the keys, or I might be using a MIDI keyboard and sending that information to the computer. I had to, because I was
Or you
building it
might
for
be
me.
using speech to text to translate, and then
Yeah, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. Now I got to go back and do that.
get your Siri and Alexa to compose the music for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, then I'll just talk to Chat GPT and say, just create a relaxing mood music for me. Um, but yeah, like, but even before all that, just making your website keyboard accessible so that you can easily navigate it with a keyboard. Because some people are just faster and they like using the keyboard. They don't want to move away to a mouse, or maybe they just have limited like wrist mobility, and doing the switch between a keyboard and a mouse might be painful, and they need to keep their hands right here. Or people who use Vim all day, they want to be able to go to your website and not use a mouse. Oh, the language. I mean, that's a much bigger topic, but yeah, I mean, being able to read your website in multiple languages I mean, we're not on Wikipedia, so you don't have to worry about
Mhm.
that. But I mean, that's another thing to think about. And if you code your website in a way to where all the content is kind of more like in a data set rather than a bunch of loose HTML pages, then you can easily make it more accessible because now you have a data set of content that can be fed into some kind of translation service and
Yeah.
expand until it finally can be read in Klingon, which is the ideal
Yeah.
state.
Now, localization is something I've had to work on in somewhat recent years, even though I'm not necessarily on the web. That's a very common problem
Hmm.
to have to solve because, yeah, there not everyone speaks the language you do.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's enough things from this site to like just for everybody to think about. But I'm curious since,
I have I have one question
oh,
for you before you ask me whatever you were going to ask me. So
mm,
when I was doing web stuff,
mm,
that was that was pre-div days. It was like you put everything in a table,
hmm,
right? But the biggest technology shift besides JavaScript is, I would say, CSS, and I
hmm,
wonder how that plays into the accessibility. Because I could see on one hand, you might even just have like a strip style sheet to switch over to, like, oh, I'm I'm colorblind, click.
hmm.
But I could also see like you hide things, and so a screen reader could easily get confused if like your CSS is set up to like not show something, for example, when it's in this class.
Yeah, I mean, I have not done, like I said, I have not really used a screen reader much, so I don't know the pain points that they face. Um, I mean, the one thing that I have done though that's related to that is like creating a second style sheet for a dark mode.
Mm,
And
yeah.
that's something that's become more regular, especially when you're working on your computer at night. I mean, the computer I'm using right now, like at a certain time automatically flips from a light mode to a dark mode just so um, you're not blinding yourself with this bright color palette when there's no outside light, diffusing it. But yeah, I've thought about doing that, and I've implemented that a couple times on websites with like a little toggle. Um, I mean, you could be even fancier and have it, I guess, have a server component to read the server time. So when it goes past nighttime, then it automatically switches. But there's actually a part of CSS. I forget what the actual tag is, but it's something you want to respect because some people, regardless of what you might think your website looks best in, still have a preference, like prefers dark even during the
Oh,
day. And so that's something you have to take into consideration that and respect as part of the browser. Like, even if you would normally say, okay, switch to the dark mode only at this time, they may say, no, 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 I like dark mode all the time. And so you look at that and then you ignore your instruction and use their instruction. So that's another, the whole respecting the user's preferences and wishes as best as possible without, I don't know, ruining seems like the wrong word, but like
right. While
modifying your
still
site.
keeping the functionality and
Yeah,
the needed things on your page. Yeah.
exactly.
All right. What was the question you had for me?
Well, I had a question for you since this has been a largely web accessibility thing because that's my background. Like beyond what you did back in the 90s, like what what have you had to contend with for accessibility or what have you been told to what standard or feature have you been asked to implement in your work?
Probably the biggest thing is the colorblind stuff.
Okay.
I've had to do that in multiple apps throughout the years, and localization also, as
Yeah.
you mentioned. And then when I was working on the helicopter software, there was a lot of like the governments and militaries have very precise specs that you must adhere to
Mhm.
for anything that's going to go in an aircraft. So there were specific things. I mentioned the thing with the track symbols and how like a hostile one was maybe like a diamond shape, but a friendly one was a circle. But also the friendly was blue, and
Mhm.
also it had a shading to it, right? Like so that kind of thing. I've had to deal with. But in general, I have not worked on things that are particularly user facing, other than the first 20 years of my life. So I don't know why I said that. Actually, most of what I've had to work on, but they aren't. but they're relatively simple applications, like a video player that doesn't have a lot of text to it to begin with. Doesn't
Right.
have a lot. It's pretty much got a play button, right?
Yeah.
So or something that's tightly controlled, like the helicopter software.
Yeah. And I guess
My current
most
role, I don't have to deal with it at all.
yeah, I guess most of my career is a lot of user facing stuff. It's just that the web accessibility stuff I guess it's somewhat newer, and so I just haven't really been forced to contend with it. Uh, and also, like you said, it's just as a human being, it's very hard to not think about the way you experience something and try to think about the way someone else might experience something. And it's like having a that empathy for, like, yeah, I'm looking at the screen right now. I'm seeing your face. I'm watching the audio get recorded in another window. But what if I couldn't see very well? Like, would this even be fun to do? Like, it's very hard for me to think about what the world would be like if I didn't have my current capabilities, and without sometimes being forced by an organization or a standard or just user feedback. Uh, to force your hand to, like, well, what about us? It's like nobody's coming to me saying, like, hey, I can't read your website because of blah blah blah. It's more like our website should do this because these people
Yes.
with these experiences do exist and may be having this experience.
Right, because you should be designing things so that everybody can use them and enjoy them, and not just certain people.
Right. The problem though is that you said should, but you're not forced to, and anything you're not forced to is harder to get everybody on board. I wanted to just to throw a shout out before we end this episode to this Microsoft inclusive design toolkit. I saw this picture. I linked it to you earlier. I don't know, probably on social media at some point. But I like the vibe and the thought process behind it, because usually when we think about designing for accessibility, I don't know, we always go to like extremes, like someone who's like Helen Keller. How would she use a website, man? But there's such a spectrum of people that you should try to design your stuff for. And so they have these four categories of touch, see, hear, and speak, and then three
Mhm.
columns of permanent, temporary, and situational. So, for example, we're talking a lot about visual stuff. So in the see permanent cell, we have someone who's blind. Okay, someone who literally can't see anything. That's that's pretty extreme from me right now, who can see the screen and what's going on. But there's also someone who may have like a cataract or a glaucoma, or maybe they just put the drops in their eyes and their pupils are dilated and they can't see very well for a few hours. That's still a situation that far more people are in. And what about them? Like, don't worry about the one person who's 100% blind. What about the person who has, an eye injury, or even better, the situational cell, which is a distracted driver?
Yeah.
Everybody has been distracted while interfacing with tech, and so you got to think about how would they be interacting with your stuff if you were in that situation.
Yeah, some of the best applications I've seen take into account situational things by, for example, recognizing when you're outside. The auto adjust contrast.
Yes.
Uh, but they can do more than that, and like switch to maybe I have white text on a black background because that's how I normally like to read because I'm reading at night. But when I'm outside, perhaps it needs to switch automatically,
Hmm.
which goes back into the day night mode. But then there's also for games in general, or most things, they're just going into a high contrast mode so that it's because everything's kind of washed out when you're out in the sun.
Right.
Yeah, there's all sorts of those.
Yeah, the here row permanent is someone who's deaf. The temporary is someone who just has an ear infection. Maybe you have too much earwax. Who knows?
Hmm.
And then situational is like a bartender. Someone who there's a lot of noise going on at all times, and so you got to think about how would you design a system. We're talking about someone like that. I mentioned in that Min, my character, was being represented in the touch permanent because he only has one arm. But there's also someone temporary, just got an arm injury. Maybe you got a cast on. You can't exactly use
Yeah.
the mouse right now, so you should be able to use your website with just one hand,
Or situational, you're holding a baby.
holding a baby, or a baguette. Who knows?
These are the kind of things I would like, and this is probably a good topic for a future podcast. I would really like to see video games take more of these things into account. Some games take some of them into account, but in general, I think there's a lot of room for accessibility improvements in that area.
And just to wrap this up, why do you think we haven't seen more at this point, Matt? What's your opinion on that?
I mean, honestly, it's pretty much what I said before. I think a lot of people are very myopic. No pun intended.
Hey, that's on the chart. No.
But you have to make a conscious effort to think about people other than yourself. And most people, without prompting, will not do that.
Yeah.
Some people are very, very empathetic, and some aren't. And there's nothing you can do to change it. And then there's the rest of the world where it's just like, if you point it out to them, they'll probably, oh yeah, I didn't think of that.
Yeah.
And it's a whole spectrum.
Right. And I think another one that we may just be skirting around is kind of the capitalism aspect of this, is that it's often...
Oh, that's why you asked me, because you thought I would just go to that answer.
I figured you would just say, because it's not profitable, Mike. It's not profitable. It's not the thing that makes the business the most money, because they're trying to target the majority of users who,
It's the 80-20 rule, right? You aim for the 80% of the people,
right,
with 20% of the features, or however the heck that works.
Yeah. It's sad that that's how it is, and it's hard to say that thing will ever change, because that feels kind of foundational to our society. But I think that as technology gets better, it's easier and easier to do this kind of thing. And if you bake it into the template of a website, that it's just accessible by design, then it ceases being difficult, and it just happens, and everybody wins.
Everybody wins.
Everybody wins. As Microsoft puts on this page, they call it solve for one, extend to many. Not that, Microsoft is the most pristine company in the world, but I did want to give them a shout out because I like this chart. So anyway.
Well, they have one of my favorite stories of I guess it's accessibility in a way that most people wouldn't think of. When they were doing, I might have even told the story on this podcast before, when they were doing their handwriting recognition software, they tested it out, and they're like, oh, this works really cool. Let's go bring it to Bill Gates. Brought it to Bill Gates. It didn't work. Why? Bill Gates is left-handed, and they were all right-handed. So they had built and tested and run, and then they went to someone who had a different experience. And so, yeah, it is an important thing to think about other people.
I love it. That was a perfect way to end this. So that's accessibility specifically to the web, but I think this can be extended to all software and hardware development if you don't have to try that hard, actually. But I think that's going to do it for this episode. Thanks for listening to Hacking the Grepson. We have more episodes on hackingthegrepson.com. And until next time, we now return you to your regularly scheduled lives, already in progress.